started. I'll try and keep the pain to a minimum, but my Times talk today is going to be about how social media has changed the organizational infrastructure available to social movements. And I'm going to talk about that in relation to 3 contemporary social movements: Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the environmental movement. So I want to start by just giving a little bit of the sort of theoretical context for thinking about social movements. So this will be sort of the boring part, and then we'll get to the more interesting part, which is examples. But there are 3 basic conditions that most scholars of social movements agree have to be present for contentious political activity, like protest, to occur. One is there has to be some sort of threat. So there has to be a group of people that perceive that there is something that's going to happen that poses a threat to or a potential harm to their well-being, their interests, or their personal liberties. The second condition then is that there needs to be some sort of opportunity to mobilize against that grievance. So structural conditions, certain structural conditions in the political system, like election cycles, right, present these opportunities where you have a vulnerable elected official potentially, or you have shifting alignments between political elites and things like this, and they present this opportunity to potentially mobilize around a political goal. And finally, this third condition, capacity for mobilization, this is really what we're interested in today. An aggrieved group has to have the capacity to amass resources and then put those resources to use in order to pursue their political goals. So this is really what is sort of central to the topic of how social media affects social movements. So we can break this down a little bit further by looking at some of the resource types that political actors would need to be able to mobilize in order to pursue political goals. So you need people, human resources. You need volunteers, you need bodies to show up at your event, right? You need leaders, and you also need like experts, so policy experts, scientific experts, legal experts, things like that. Material resources, of course, you need money to fund an organization or to fund a professional legal expert, for instance. You also need basic things like office space or a place to meet, things like that. Cultural capital would refer to things like education, expertise, and particularly social ties are important. Social ties bring people to movements, they're a way to recruit people to movements, and they bind people to movements. So people are more likely to participate in movements when they personally know somebody who is going to turn out to an activity of some sort. And finally, most relevant to our talk, organizational infrastructure. So movements, that would be community groups, existing community groups, that would be institutional ties, and particularly relevant for social media, communication networks are really important. And so scholars like Doug McAdam and Alvin Morris, in studying the civil rights movement, found that how the civil rights movement was really able to effectively organize was by using the existing organizational infrastructure in communities. So I want you to think about how, I give this example because I want you to think about how this differs from how contemporary movements often mobilize as we move through these examples. So civil rights activists didn't start with Martin Luther King didn't start with the Southern Nonviolent, or the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He didn't start with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? How these movements initiated was actually in the 1950s through NAACP chapters, black colleges, and black congregational networks. So these existing organizations in African American communities served as sort of the foundation through which then the movement organizations were built. And so through those existing organizations, activists were able to mobilize money, resources. They had this ready-built communication infrastructure that was sort of isolated from repressive whites, basically. And so it was that existing community infrastructure that served as the foundation for the whole movement to get going. So this really differs quite a bit from the context in which contemporary movements are forming. So a lot of contemporary movements are forming in these digital spaces, and that presents a number of interesting opportunities and also challenges for contemporary movements. And that's what I would like to talk a little bit about today. Let's see. The New York Times article that I picked out, Millennials in the Age of Tumblr Activism, I thought this was kind of an interesting piece. If you get a chance to look at this, it's a couple of years old. This is from December 2014. But it talks about how millennials, so there's this big sort of stereotype about millennials that they're not very politically engaged, that they're really apathetic, they don't really care about what's going on in the world around them. And this article really posed a counterpoint to that, saying that, it's just that activism doesn't look like, millennial activism doesn't look like some of these classic examples of, Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights era organizations. But they talked about how Tumblr is this really interesting space because it allows young people to connect based on interests. So whereas Facebook, you connect based on personal ties, people that you know, family members, right? In the Tumblr environment, you're connecting to other people that you don't know necessarily based on shared interests. And that this allows this space where people can really, it's more anonymous on the one hand, and that it allows this space for people to connect based on their political identities and to cultivate political identities. And so this is actually a really important component of getting people to participate in movements, right? We know there's a lot of research that demonstrates that people have to have not just an identity or sort of an interest in whatever the political issue is, they also need to have an activist identity in order to participate, to be motivated to actually participate in the movement activity. So Tumblr provides this interesting space because they're connecting to people based on issue interests in the first place. And then also, it provides a forum for sharing really provocative, politicized images with each other. And that helps kind of maintain that activist identity and that politicized identity in that space. But then this article also talks about some of the limits of this type of engagement, right? Being that if you don't transfer that political engagement out of the virtual community into the real world, right? If you're not showing up at campaign events, if you're not showing up at a public hearing for a policy that affects your community, right? Then it's great that we have these these digitally connected, politically conscious young people, but if they don't show up, right, outside of those virtual spaces, then there's a real limit to the amount of social change that can be achieved based on these digital networks, right? So the article kind of troubles that, pointing out some of the benefits of that space and also the limitations. And that's the project that I would like to do today, is talking about some of the challenges and opportunities that social media and digital communication networks present in a few examples of contemporary movements. So starting with Occupy Wall Street. So in September of 2011, activists created an encampment in Zuccotti Park in New York. This is kind of a messy image here. They're turning over police barricades that had been set up. But at any rate, they occupied Zuccotti Park in New York. And this started with a call to action that was put out through a website or a network called Adbusters. And so this is like a political advocacy network. They are leftist in orientation, pro-environment, pro-progressive, et cetera, right? They're kind of a generalist progressive organization. And so they put out this call and called people to come and participate in this encampment at Zuccotti Park in New York. And some of the factors that precipitated this, to put this in context a little bit, so 2011 is, of course, just on the tail end of the great economic recession from 2008. So we have this economic downturn and then the prompt bailout of the banks, right? And so that is taking place at the same time that all of these young people that have graduated college in 2011 are hitting a labor market that is extremely tight, right? As the economy takes this downturn and the labor market constricts, then you have all these young people that have record-breaking student loan debt in this era, and then at the same time minimal chances of employment that is going to help them pay back that debt. So you have this, and then the bailout of the banks represented this sort of increasing inequality in the distribution of wealth in America, right? And really made this a really salient political issue. And so in that context, that social unrest, then you also have a global wave of protest that's going on with the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square. I probably slaughtered the pronunciation of that. But the Arab Spring is taking place, also a movement mobilized through digital communication networks. This first book here, Networks of Outrage and Hope, talks about Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, and also social movements that happened in Iceland, maybe? if I'm remembering that right. So at any rate, there's a lot of digital organization of movements happening at the same time. And so in some respects, Occupy Wall Street is sort of jumping on the bandwagon of this existing political activity. And responding to what was seen as this, ridiculous treatment of irresponsible white-collar crime, essentially. So what was kind of cool about this movement, though, is how they used digital communication networks to coordinate their actions. So they set up these encampments, and part of this project was what we call prefigurative politics. So they're trying to create this community in their encampments that embodies their vision of politics and political equality. So they organize, they have this is their communication center here, where they're managing their digital communication network and setting up online infrastructure for themselves. They had their other images. If you search, you'll see that you can find the libraries that they set up, like communal libraries. They had communal health centers and child care centers and things like that, all in this encampment. So they're trying to create this kind of collective community that that is their vision of the whole, what they would like America to look like, basically. And as part of that, they wanted to have horizontal leadership. And they used Twitter in a really interesting way to accomplish this, right? So instead of having if you take the example of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Martin Luther King's organization, right? So this was very much organized around the idea that you have a charismatic figure, right? That was Dr. Martin Luther King, and that this would be your leader of the movement, your single person that everyone sort of was inspired to rally around, right? Well, I have Ella Baker pictured here, who worked in the SCLC under Dr. Martin Luther King for a number of years, and eventually split off and formed the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which became sort of a more radical civil rights organization. But one of her main beefs with the way the SCLC was organized and Dr. Martin Luther King's organization operated was that her vision of how a movement should work is that your movement would create a community of potential leaders, that all of the members that participate in your movement ought to have a say in what the strategic direction of that movement is, and they ought to leave there with the ability to go on and start their own community organizations, and that in that way your political activity can grow. But the problem with having a charismatic leader is that you only have your organization is unstable, right? That if all of your movement activity revolves around that person, if they're if they leave the movement or if they are assassinated, say, right, then your organization just dies, basically, because it's all built around that one person. And so Occupy kind of takes up that ideology, right? And they use Twitter in this really interesting way to be able to allow people to weigh in on decision making. So in that way, it opened this platform that everybody could weigh in on what actions were going to be held, where they were going to take place, and when. And so you're communicating not just information about where to show up and what to be doing at that time, but also it allowed people to weigh in on decision making in an interesting way. I think that's all I want to say about that. So it allowed them to weigh in on decision making. But one of the problems with this, though, Occupy became kind of famous for being this leaderless movement, that there wasn't this single person that you could point out. And in some respects, it was effective, because had they had a couple of people that you could sort of pinpoint, those would have been prime targets, of course, for police to target and to take out of the picture, right? So it made it really difficult to police the movement and to shut it down, because there wasn't a clear sense of well, here's our gal who is in charge of this, right? And so it sort of, in some respects, created some disorientation and made it harder to police. But on the other hand, when you don't have that clear system of structure of accountability, when you don't have a clear leadership structure in place, it makes it really difficult to say, define clear objectives that you want to pursue as a movement, right? And that's another big criticism of this movement, is that really what came out of this. That they never really managed to lay out and to clearly articulate, here are the political goals that we want to achieve, and here's how we're going to knock those out one by one. That wasn't really a thing that they were able to, no policy was really produced based on their protests, right? And so that's kind of a downside of it. They had these meetings, they would meet, and they had these long consensus decision-making processes where everybody had to agree before they left the meeting on what we were going to do, at the end of this. The problem with that is that those meetings can become very arduous. They're long, they're drawn out. They're really fruitful in that they create a really democratic movement where everybody has equal ability to weigh in on the decisions that the group makes. But they take forever, right? I mean, if everybody has to be on the same page before you can make a decision, that's a very lengthy meeting process. And it also can be really hard to settle on a strategic course of action. So all of this was facilitated through the use of Twitter and social media. And there were some strengths of this, as I pointed out, and also some liabilities, like having that central point of accountability and things like that to kind of glue the movement together and set them on a real pointed strategic course. Okay, now I want to shift to Black Lives Matter. So this is a slightly different way in which social media matters to this movement, and slightly different set of opportunities and consequences for this movement. So Black Lives Matter originated in a Facebook post written by Black feminist activist Alicia Garza. In July 2013, Garza wrote on Facebook a post called A Love Letter to Black People. The post was meant as an affirmation for a community that was distraught about the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. So Garza's post reads, "The sad part is," this is an excerpt of her full post, "The sad part is there's a section of America who is cheering and celebrating right now, and it makes me sick to my stomach. We gotta get it together, y'all. By the way, stop saying we are not surprised. That's a damn shame in itself. I continue to be surprised at how little Black lives matter, and I will continue that. Stop giving up on Black life." So the post ended then with, "Black people, I love you, I love us, our lives matter." And then a friend of Garza's, Patricia Cullors, created a hashtag out of those last three letters, which is what we're all familiar with, this hashtag Black Lives Matter. And it wasn't until about a year later, though, when 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson, that would be the Ferguson case, that Black Lives Matter really generated a broad following. But what's interesting about this, if you think about where and how this movement emerged differs from those more traditional civil rights organizations that I opened this description with. So you have civil rights movements that sort of originates and organizations from that movement that originate in religious and cultural communities, right? Community organizations, and form formal movement organizations. So in contrast, Black Lives Matter starts in this virtual space. It starts with this hashtag and people picking up this hashtag and affiliating themselves with this cause through the hashtag. And then they form a formal movement organization later on. So in 2014, they did form a national organization, and it's structured actually, it's a federated chapter structure, so kind of like the Sierra Club. They have a national organization, and if you want to form a chapter at your state or local level, you go through the national organization. You agree to their mission statement, their vision statement, their terms, whatever other terms of operation they dictate, and then and you do have the opportunity to weigh in on the strategic direction of the national organization, but you're kind of technically bound by the national organization's policies. So they do have a formal movement organization, right? But the problem is that because Black Lives Matter emerged in this virtual space, the virtual space doesn't have boundaries, right? There are no boundaries with who can hashtag a post with hashtag Black Lives Matter. And because it emerges in this much more ambiguous space than these traditional organizations, Black Lives Matter has a real problem with boundary maintenance, with setting the boundaries around who can claim to be participating in the movement and who is just appropriating the movement for whatever else outside of like the formally sanctioned movement organization. So this raises some really interesting questions, right? So how do you define membership in a movement that emerges in a virtual space where a hashtag is your representation of belonging? How is accountability for actions taken in the name of this organization determined? And how are the actions of vigilantes distinguished from formally sanctioned movement actions, right? And I have this picture up here. It's kind of hard, maybe it's kind of hard to see, but yes, it's completely hard to see. So this is a protest that happened in Carbondale, Illinois. This was where I did my PhD at Southern Illinois University. And so this is a group of activists who I was familiar with because they were sort of like there were anarchists, there were a bunch of grad students who were anarchist activists, and they sort of crashed a lot of different kinds of political events, right, that happened around town. And so, at any rate, so here they are, they're downtown. This picture came from the Southern Illinoisan, and the report attached to this, it reported that they were holding this banner which says, we have each other, we don't need the cops. And some of them have masks on and things like that. So that's a pretty inflammatory statement, right? And if you read the mission statement, the vision statement of Black Lives Matter, it's a radical movement, right? But it's not necessarily explicitly endorsing this kind of really divisive type of language. So at any rate, I got curious about this because the report of this that accompanied this picture said that the activists were carrying their banners and signs and chanting Black Lives Matter while walking with this banner, right? And so I knew who these folks were, and that they were not necessarily specifically Black Lives Matter activists. This image is all white students actually as well. And so I looked up on the Black Lives Matter website and found that there's actually no Black Lives Matter chapter in Carbondale, Illinois. So there's no formally sanctioned chapter. So these are just people who've picked up this phrase and inserted it into basically an anarchist political platform and movements and demonstrations that they're doing as sort of part of that, right? So it becomes really interesting to then set boundaries around and control the message of a movement that emerges in this kind of virtual space where anybody can kind of pick it up. And it seems like it's this free thing that anybody can jump on. It becomes really difficult to control what exactly do we stand for and what message is it that we want to give to the public. And well, why does that matter? Well, it matters quite a bit because if a movement becomes associated with violence, which Black Lives Matter absolutely has, right? If a movement becomes associated with violence, this legitimates more severe repression of that movement. And it also makes it less likely that you can gain public support for that movement. So this is Sid Taro, who is one of the kind of foundational scholars of social movement. He's actually a political scientist, but the study of social movements. And he writes, where violence occurs or is even likely, this gives authorities a mandate for repression and turns sympathizers away. When this happens, organizations are trapped in a spiral of military confrontation with authorities that in the modern age is virtually impossible for them to win. And so what he's saying there is that basically that this state will always have more guns, bigger guns, and more of them, right? And so the idea that you're going to engage in some kind of violent uprising with the state is it's a surefire way to torpedo your movement, basically, and also to make people feel less supportive towards whatever cause you are working towards, and then he goes on to say that this may be why most of the forms of collective action that we see in the modern day take on a nonviolent form. So nonviolent direct action has become a really popular movement tactic, like obstructing something that's going on. So whether that's blocking the streets, or whether that is, these are activists that are trying to obstruct construction of a project. That looks like a unconventional oil and gas well in the background. So these are probably environmental activists that are trying to prevent construction of something that they think is environmentally destructive. So it's, potentially, yes, it could be law breaking, right? But the idea is that in nonviolent demonstrations, people are not engaging in anything that's going to harm somebody. There might be some public or some property damages involved, but no personal damage. And that's been a distinction that's been really difficult for Black Lives Matter to maintain. And I would argue that that's partially because of of how this movement started and the open space that it kind of originated from, compared to those more the community organizations that traditionally civil rights activists used. But the online communication networks, they do facilitate this nonviolent protest activity in kind of an interesting way. If we go back to the example of Occupy Wall Street for a minute, one of the things that Occupy activists were able to do as they were engaging in their nonviolent demonstrations is they were able to capture interactions between protesters and police officers, right? And they were able to document any kind of, sort of conflicted actions that took place and interactions that happened between those parties. And then they publish those on YouTube and things like that. And by creating that, so social media allows for that independent media production that on the one hand creates more accountability for police officers, and then on the other hand allows them to control the narrative to a certain extent, right? At least as much as they can get the views on Facebook and on social media, they have a platform to kind of create media outside of traditional venues and control the narrative a bit. Okay, so finally then, the environmental movement has used digital communication networks in some really interesting ways. And I'm gonna talk about a specific case study from Southern Illinois that I'm familiar with, but just because this really exemplifies how environmental organizations use digital communication networks, and I think this is a good example of that. So a lot of environmental organizations in the US today are at the national level. They have cultivated these huge listservs, and environmental advocacy is very science and policy technical, right? So you really need legal experts, policy experts, and scientific experts in order to be considered a meaningful policy player on most environmental issues. And so the environmental movement, in order to cultivate those kind of expert human resources and the cultural capital that's needed to have a seat at the policy-making table, the environmental movement has had to professionalize itself. So organizations like the National Resources Defense Council, they have sort of a normalized seat at the table. They get to participate in policy construction on a lot of important issues, and because they're sort of a routine player in policy and lawmaking on environmental issues. However, that organization is sort of like heavy on the legal and technical experts and light on the civic engagement, right? You don't have necessarily a lot of members of that organization that are going to show up to a rally or turn out to an event. And a lot of environmental organizations have this problem where they've become these organizations that are very expert and technical, focus on the policy expertise and scientific technical expertise, but then don't have necessarily a large membership basis. So one way to combat that, to cultivate that membership base in a way that doesn't necessarily take resources away from your experts, is to cultivate these mass listservs, right? You have this huge listserv of people you can email and send out action alerts to when there's a particular moment, like there's a policy initiative that's up for vote right now or up for discussion in the White House. You can send an email to your members, or a petition to sign or something like that. So probably all of you have received a petition from an organization so you have kind of an idea of how this works. But it's a way that you can get people to participate. You give them an easy way to participate, and it costs you virtually nothing. It doesn't matter, whereas if you were trying to send people mailers, for instance, you would be more pressed to try and identify who are the people that are most likely to respond to my mailing, right? Because you don't want to waste your postage stamp. Maybe it costs a lot of money to send out 1,000 mailers, right? And you don't want to waste your money by sending it to somebody who's unlikely to mail that in to their representative or whatever. But in the digital space, digital communication networks encourage organizations to become more generalists, right? Like they don't actually need to make sure that you're going to send in that mailer that I spent all that postage on and spent all that money printing, because I can send you a digital call to action that costs me nothing. And so I then have an interest in cultivating 10,000 listserv members, right, versus those 1,000 really active participants. And that means that I want to appeal to the sort of common denominator of interests in as wide a swath of the population as I can, right? And environmental organizations and progressive, like leftist activist organizations have done a lot of this. And now conservative organizations have not, they've been sort of slow to adopt some of these networking techniques, and they're getting on the ball with it now, of course, but this was really led out of the left wing, and so that's kind of why that's going to be the focus a bit. So what happened in Illinois was, Illinois in 2013 passed a hydraulic fracturing regulatory act. So rather than regulating oil and gas, the unconventional oil and gas extraction, which is like a newer technique under the existing laws, they created a whole new law just to apply to this technique of oil and gas extraction. And as part of that, there was this opportunity that was created because as part of so they passed a law, and then the Illinois Department of Natural Resources had to write a set of rules to implement the law on the ground. And so as part of that rulemaking process, they were mandated to offer public participation in the rulemaking. Well, this presents this great opportunity for activists who don't like fracking, right, unconventional oil and gas extraction. For activists who don't like this, it presents a really good opportunity. So what they did was there were 5 public hearings around the state in various locations from south to, so Illinois is like opposite of Kansas. It's like long and skinny, right? So north to south rather than east to west. So they held all these meetings north to south across the state. And then they also accepted written public comments for 45 days. And there were a number of organizations that they wrote a comment, they sent their listserv members a comment a day. And these were researched, cited, comments that took apart one section of the rule document and offered a critique of one section of the rule document. So 45 comments, 45 sections of the rule document for 45 days. And they sent these to all their members, and so you could modify it if you wanted, but potentially all you had to do was sign your name and send it right on into DNR, right? And then the other thing that some organizations did was they had these petitions, and so they would get members to sign their name on these petitions, and they submitted these petitions. And in some cases, they submitted these petitions, like each petition signature was its individual submission, right? So in doing this, they managed to amass 37,000 public comments over this 45-day period. So just as a point of comparison, this agency that had to process all these comments, on average, they received 1 comment per rule for the year. Right? Like, so for every rule they write, on average, they receive 1 comment. So think about what this means. This means that they have, some poor schmuck who's like scanning Christmas cards into digital copies, right? Because this happened over the holidays, and so as a joke, people sent in Christmas cards with comments on them and stuff. And they had to digitize all these and create a public record out of it. But what that enabled us to do as researchers was they created this awesome archive that had people's their names, their addresses, and their organizational affiliations. And this was all then turned into a digital public record. And so what we were able to do then was look at, so who were these people that sent these 37,000 public comments? And so a colleague and I used text mining software to pull out the names and addresses of these people and the organizational affiliations. And I'll flip back to that in a second, but what we found was that what was kind of interesting about this is that by and large, the comments that were submitted to DNR did not come from communities that were actually going to see any of this kind of technology, this oil and gas technique used to extract oil and gas. So if you look at this map, the black lines represent communities that have, so Illinois doesn't have active oil, they have conventional oil and gas drilling, but this was before they had started doing unconventional oil and gas drilling. So the black lines represent potential for shale, that there's like shale under this southeast corner of Illinois. So there's potential for development there. So, and the bubbles represent the number of comments, and then the shaded areas, this is like normalized by population. So you can see, so obviously we would expect there to be more comments that came from Chicago, right, which is this northeast corner of Illinois. But that doesn't mean much. You kind of have to consider the population size in relation to some of the smaller rural areas, right? And that's what is represented by the shading. So when you look at this darker blue area, you can see there were a lot of people that were hot about this issue from the neighbors of the people that expected to have development, right? So this big bubble down here is Jackson County, Illinois, which is home to Southern Illinois University, right? But they're actually just on the periphery of development. There's no shale under Jackson County. So their neighbors were a little mad about it. And then the other big comment submission centers were Chicago and Champaign-Urbana, another university center, and Springfield, right? So this is where the majority of the comments came from. And then we were able to break down, well, so what were the organizational connections of the people that sent these comments? And so this is kind of interesting. When you compare these 3 diagrams to this lower one here, so this is Credo Action. These were the people that submitted public comments that said that they were a member of Credo Action. And so you can see that Credo really did a lot of mobilizing, particularly around Chicago. Again, these urban centers, Chicago, Springfield, and a little bit in Jackson County, which is not really an urban center, but is politically different from the rest of the region, the Southern Illinois region, because of the presence of the university. It's more left-leaning than the rest of the area. Sierra Club, you can see, has a really, their presence is really spread all across the state. So they mobilize people from all across the state, really, using those public a day, or comment a day, and petitions, the member petitions. 350.org had a big presence in Chicago. And then down here, Frack for Illinois is this weird organization. They mobilize people using a petition, and they had a lot of connections in the downstate area. So, and the founder of that is based in Springfield, which is why there's a little bit more participation there. But now these people down here, these are counties, or these are people that had listed no organizational affiliation. So what's really interesting about this is that this tells us that if you sent a comment from the targeted shale play, you were more likely to do so, not because you were contacted by some organization that said, here's a thing, send in this petition, right? People that mobilized from downstate, they weren't necessarily tapped into these organizational networks. But in order to so it really shows us how important these digital communication networks are for connecting people that don't really have a stake in an issue, for pulling them into the movement and getting them to participate in something, right? And then another thing that we did with this was, and I don't have a cool map to show of this, I just an ugly regression table, so I didn't put that on in the slides. But another thing we did with this was we looked at the precinct level election results using the Harvard Election Data Archive. And what we saw with this is that, so we were looking at the communities using, it's kind of a rough matchup between the zip codes that we have from the residential addresses on the comments and the precinct level voter data. But we were kind of able to roughly match where people came from, what precinct they're from, and then and whether that precinct is left or right leaning. So are they more likely to, do they vote more Republican or Democratic, Republican or Democratic in the last election? And what we found was that people that were mobilized through these digital communication networks were much more likely to come from left-leaning communities, to have come from communities that voted Democratic in the previous election. And people that did send in comments from this downstate region, so there are some dots here in this targeted shale region. There are just fewer dots than outside of it, right? But those people that did send in comments from the targeted development zone, they were less likely to be partisan affiliated. So they didn't lean more left or right. They were across the political spectrum, right? So it really shows us how much these digital networks, or these digital communication networks, or these social movement organizations are able to use the digital communication networks to tap into these sentiment pools, right? These people that are kind of connected through these organizational affiliations, these broad progressive organizations, and they can tap into them and really amplify. So if we look at this group right here, the people on the periphery of development, they were able to really amplify their opposition to fracking by tapping into these, sort of their progressive counterparts throughout the state, using these connections, these partisan networks. And so on the one hand, that's all well and good for them, but this does raise some questions about political representation and democratic process, right? Because in this area in southeast Illinois, there is a long history of conventional oil production and coal mining. And so if you know anything about these two industries, you know that both are on the decline, right? And so this area has had very little economic stimulation in the last several decades. And there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of problems with substance abuse and methamphetamine addiction, right? Like these are common rural problems that sort of plague rural communities are happening in that area. And so as part of my research, I talked to people from some of those communities, and they were really looking forward to what they perceived as a potential for economic development that would be at least, even if it was short term, there would be some businesses that would be generated by allowing this unconventional oil and gas development. And so they felt like they really got screwed, basically, by this process, right? Because in submitting having to process these 37,000 public comments, it really slowed down the policymaking process. And so if you're an anti-fracking activist, this was a really successful thing to do because it slowed down the policy process. And coincidentally enough, it slowed it down just enough that the market happened to tank about the time that they finished the rulemaking. And so so far there's been one well drilled, and this law was passed in 2013. So in about 4 years, one well has been drilled, right? But if you're from this rural area in southeastern Illinois that is really hurting economically and looking for, and pretty desperate basically for any kind of economic stimulation, you really feel like misrepresented, right? Their perception is more that this policy process enabled people to weigh in on something that an issue that they don't have a stake in, and to determine something for their neighbors, right? And that had a negative economic impact on this zone. And that's their perception of this issue, that in allowing these outsiders to get active on this issue, that this really disenfranchised them. And so it does raise some issues about political representation, and if you can have all these people like sort of systematically weighing in on a policy issue, does this take away the voice of people who actually have a dog in the fight, right? Who actually have a stake in what's going to happen here. And another thing this raises an issue about is sort of getting back to that New York Times piece about millennials in the age of Tumblr activism, right? This is a qualitatively different kind of movement participation than the sort of civil rights era consciousness raising that happened in a lot of civil rights organizations, right? I mean, it's the amount of engagement. They're successful because they've reduced political participation to clicking a button and sending in a petition signature or sending in a form comment. You don't even have to know anything about the issue to be able to participate in it, because you have this nicely researched critique, right? But on the other hand, is this really like a deep form of political engagement? Well, no, right? Do people know more about politics, about democracy? Is this really inspiring critical conversations, right? And growing people's civic engagement in a meaningful way? Possibly not, right? So it's trade-offs, and that the trade-off of efficiency is possibly a more shallow type of civic engagement than the type that was inspired by some of the civil rights organizations, civil rights era organizations. So just to recap some of the things we've talked about, that digital communication networks and social media can be really useful for coordinating actions, for facilitating more democratic engagement in some cases, and broader participation in movement decisions. It also allows for rapid strategic innovation and adaptation, and for rapid action on policy issues particularly. And it creates these easy ways for people to participate in movements. So you don't have to give like a whole day or weekend or something to show up to a protest event. You can just sign your petition and send it on in. But on the other hand, this does present some challenges with defining boundaries of who is a sort of certified participant, who is a certified leader of a movement, and what kind of accountability structure do you have in place with the movement. And then it also raises some questions about political representation, as I said. So there's trade-offs with this. There are potentials and possibilities, and then there are also some limitations to what you can achieve. So I'm going to end with this little plug here, that during the spring 2018 semester, sociology is offering a contemporary social movements course. And so if any of this sounded interesting to you, I would encourage you to sign up for this course. And we're going to talk more about origins of movements, the implications of movements for democracy, intersection of movements and political institutions, and also collective identity formation in movements, how movements generate collective identity and use existing collective identity, as I talked about, use these existing activist identities to fuel movement activity. And we'll also look at some of the potential impacts that movements have. Movements have impacts on participants, they have impacts on each other, they have impacts on society, and so we're going to assess some of those different ways that impacts our social movements create social change and impact our social world. And I have handouts associated with that. And these are some of the books. Well, this book is relevant to what we talked about today as far as digital communication networks in social movements, contemporary social movements. And these 3 books are books that we will use in the course among some other items. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I think we have plenty of time for questions. Some time for questions, comments, complaints, concerns. Yeah.
Can you show the map?
Yeah.
I guess I don't have my contacts, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're fine. Which one? This one or that?
Yeah, that one. So in the South fracking area right there, are there any circles in there?
Yeah, there are some. There were some comments that came from the targeted development zone.
Was it
but fewer
left
than
or right?
What's that?
Was it like left or right?
Yeah, there was no significant political partisan affiliation in that zone. So that would suggest, right? I mean, of course, that's the problem with quantitative stuff. You can't necessarily, we didn't go out and ask these people what their motives are. But we can kind of infer that these people probably weren't motivated by some partisan bias, right? They probably had some legitimate concern about, how this is going to affect them. And one thing we did look at is these counties, comments that came from within the counties that have potential for shale development, they are more likely to have, they have a stronger share of tourist economy that makes up their economic activity. So the other thing, there's this little strip of forest that runs through the southeastern part of southern Illinois particularly and goes on into Indiana. And it's a really beautiful area if you've ever been there. And so there are some people there that probably were concerned about how this is going to affect the wine trails in the area, how this is going to affect hiking, kayaking, and some of those like cabin rentals and things like that if you have these, kind of big, ugly industrial zones set up in these, in what was forest area, basically. So, but whereas what's really interesting is when you look outside of this area, these people came from communities that were overwhelmingly leftist, right? So it suggests that how you're hooking in these people that don't really have a stake in the cause is through these partisan networks. Yeah.
Do you think like the component of social media is making it harder for organizations to get their actual voice out because it's so easy for people to just see an image or see some bogus headline and just share it on Facebook really quick and get like all this mass hysteria about it? Or do you think it is good and bad because it kind of like gives them a wider net to cast when getting the information out there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the and or, right? That it's probably, I think it's both, definitely. That and in studying activist organizations, this is largely how activists, like, you're not really an organization if you don't have a Facebook page, right? And this is really how they communicate and they share information. And part of this is about being able to tell that story through social media that you want your members and you want the public to see about you and your cause and how you see this issue. And this goes either way. So, previously I looked at this, this case in Illinois and the anti-fracking activists, but now I've done a lot of research on organizations that advocate for mineral owners, right? So those would be pro-oil and gas type organizations. And it's either way, right? That social media allows you to tell a story about your shtick, right? Whatever your cause is. And it can be really effective at that. But yeah, absolutely. It allows for trolling. It allows for people to, take things that you're sharing and distort them, and can definitely complicate things. So it's, there's just trade-offs with it. Absolutely. Yeah.
All social movements, political movements, whatever, have had rough edges and kind of leaking boundaries for a very long time.
Yeah.
So let me throw in a question to you in terms of where we are in 2017. Do the Russians play any role in terms of what we're doing here? I mean, I would think so. And they're not just Russians or North Koreans or anybody that can hack into the site that you're talking about to a great extent. So do we have an international involvement that wasn't there before?
Potentially. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I guess I would wonder what. Now, I think that it'd be hard for them to get into like MoveOn.org, right, or 350.org. I mean, now as far as circulating doubt about certain information, right, or inserting information, or creating kind of spoof organizations that they can use to circulate information that would be used to manipulate public consciousness. Like, sure, that could be a thing. But I think as far as like infiltrating some of these organizations and shaping the message, like that would be a really scary thing. If somebody could get inside MoveOn.org or whatever and shape the messages that they're actually sending out to the public, I would think that they have some control over that. But that would be an interesting problem.
But in terms of Black Lives Matter, for example,
Yeah.
I mean, it's already been shown that basically they're pitting Black Lives Matter against other kinds of social movements and organizations. So it's not necessarily getting in and distorting the information within the movement itself. It's taking basically the rhetoric and the language of the organization and pitting it against other social movements of various types, which is a little bit different in terms of the speed at which it occurs. It has occurred in the past, but I think it's probably occurring more now than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of, like in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of saboteurs, like plants, that people would plant people in movements and specifically to cause divisiveness or to break up, to split up the movement. And the capacity for that, I mean, it sounds like what you're getting at is the capacity for that is so much greater, yes, in a digital environment. And it just adds to the list of potential liabilities. I mean, with there are, again, there are these interesting potentials to collaborate, to coordinate, to create your own narrative in digital spaces, but yes, it absolutely opens you up to co-optation in really interesting ways too, and really problematic ways.
Right.
I want to say this is a comment, not a question, but Forsyth Library has "They Can't Kill Us All" by Wesley Lowery, about the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement and how that shook out in the wake of Ferguson. So I would definitely recommend that to anybody who is interested in this topic.
If there are other great books that we should have on this topic that we don't, there is a form out there on our website where you can suggest a purchase. So just looking at all the titles we have up here, let us know.